Hey YouTube, welcome to the podcast. I want to thank you guys for jumping over here from our podcasting platforms where it's kind of built to be the main focus. But here we'll be able to add extended cuts, be able to see some of the emotions, maybe even have some of the outtakes. Either way, it's going to be fun. This will be a great complement to the actual podcast. But over the first couple episodes, you'll see that the formatting for Around My Frame right now, as well as the set itself, will probably change as we're still trying to figure out how everything is going to look. So bear with us, and if you'd like, please give us comments of how you think it could be changed or altered, what you think looked good, what didn't look good, and we'll continue to change that over the first couple episodes or so before we find our rhythm. So thank you. Let's jump into it now. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Conservation Made Simple podcast. My name is Cameron.
And I'm Logan. We're excited to have you here for the first episode of Controversial Conservation.
Yes, it's going to be a good one today. To kind of give a background on how controversial conservation is going to be set up, we will be doing a opening pitch of sorts, and then from there going into kind of the main discussion. We've altered a little bit to a format that allows both of us to kind of embody a person that would fully believe the side that we're going to be arguing. So in today's example, we're doing solar and wind, renewable energy in the United States. Does it work? Does it not? Pros, cons, so on and so forth. One of us, I, will be taking the it does not, it's a scam of sorts. Logan is taking the opposite.
I am.
So we will both be trying to embody basically a person that may be living in a community that would take that stance, or is maybe in the mindset that that's what's happening. And have that discussion we're going to try to keep it at a cap of 45 minutes, maybe a little less. We'll try not to go too much longer. And then from there, transition over into our own personal opinions, kind of where do we stand with it. And the goal of this, one of the things that Logan and I were talking about yesterday, is we understand and recognize that the two of us have a lot of biases in our own life based off of how we were raised, religious backgrounds, just kind of life in general has a lot of biases. So what we determine to be truth or not truth is affecting this conversation. So
As is similar for most people.
As it is, yeah, everyone has a different bias and has different things that then affect what do they believe in. So when it comes to this, we're going to try to strip away as many of those as we can and come at this as an unbiased person, which is not really a real, it's not a real person. There's no one who's totally unbiased. But we're going to try to be unbiased in these discussions, because then what that does is it allows you guys to form your own opinions. And we'll get into that afterwards, but without further ado, we'll get into our opening pitches.
Our opening pitches.
Would
you like to begin?
I will begin. Like I said, I will be taking the stance that renewable energy from wind and solar is a scam. This comes from energy companies taking cheap renewable energy and selling it at much higher. Jobs are going to be lost from coal and natural gas. You will also be impacting the environment in ways that are not the perfect way that is touted by renewable energy sources. And above all else, it is ultimately something that just will not and could not ever work here in the United States. What do you got to say?
So I'll be taking the stance that wind and solar renewable energy is the energy of the future. It's not a scam. In fact, it's the only energy that is going to be able to be continually used as we move forward. Fossil fuels are running out. There is a finite supply, whereas with renewable energy, there's an infinite amount. There will always be sunlight and there will always be wind. That is not true necessarily in every single location, but if we're to build a grid in a sustainable and intelligent way, then we'll have infinite amounts of energy for the future. In addition, it's something that we have to do because as climate change is moving forward, we have to leave certain amounts of our fossil fuels in the ground if we hope to aim for a 2 degrees Celsius rise versus a 5 degrees Celsius rise or more.
Nice. So one of the points that you said, and I'm going to get right into it. So one of the points that you said that it's an unending source. Can't argue that. However, based off the fact that the world population is by no means going to ever stop, right? Also an unending source.
Also an unending source.
We are already coming to the problem of running out of land, running out of space to live. How do you feel in terms of, or what would be your solution to being able to provide energy for all of those with how much land is needed for your renewable energy?
Yeah,
you're speaking of.
That's a great question. So one of the biggest things that's coming out right now is actually you can take all of the farms that are across the entirety of the US and how much land we dedicate to crops and livestock. And there's studies that have shown that you can put wind farms on those pieces of land and the cattle don't mind, the livestock don't mind, they'll graze right up to the base of the windmill. So rather than having to convert land into something new, we can just use land that we're already using in a better way.
So I love that, the ability to utilize both. However, I think when it comes to environmental issues, or especially in this one, the real argument comes from not what's going to be hurting our cattle and our livestock, and well, I guess the same thing. But our livestock and our crops, but what's going to be hurting the wildlife in the area. One of the things is that cattle, naturally they churn up the ground. You bring in a lot of, say, worms or grubs or whatever to the surface, which then brings in other animals and then brings in your predators and so on and so forth. Natural system works because of these grazing animals. Well, windmills are notorious for killing birds. And a study by the Center of Biological Diversity said that the Altima Pass wind farm that's in California is a population sink for golden eagles and burrowing owls. It continues with the idea from the Royal Society for the Preservation of Birds, so outside the US for a second, but said that the wind farms off the coast of Great Britain could be the last nail in the coffin for endangered seabirds. A 2017 report from the American Bird Conservancy showed hundreds of thousands of birds and bats die every year, which bats are your pollinators, which is hard for your crops because you need them out there. Also, if we wanted to switch over to solar, which I know isn't your argument yet, but I can feel it already coming, that you can put I know that you can put solar on top of crops, certain crops. Obviously, I'm not trying to put it on top of corn. It grows too tall. But solar panels themselves can produce up to 900-degree heat waves above the farm, which burns up the birds that would fly over and also can destroy the crops underneath depending on how close they get. And the last point on that is that for the Ivanpah solar farm in California, it required the removal of threatened desert turtles from their burrows, where many of them died in the process of trying to dig them up, put them in cages, and move them somewhere just to construct the area. So when you're saying that you can utilize the land, you're talking about places that, if you're talking about crops, you need bats to be able to come in. If you were talking about bees or anything that's going to be pollinating, it's going to attract other stuff, which your birds, and then they're going to hit the windmills. If you're talking about solar panels, it looks like, to be able to utilize that one, you can't use it for cattle, but it would also burn up and bring in some other elements there. So any points on that?
Yeah. So what I would say to that is that, yes, there have been issues with how windmills affect birds, but the amount of birds that die from windmills is a fraction of the amount of birds that die from all of the pollution that we put into the atmosphere every year. So yes, windmills kill birds. They kill about 140,000 to 500,000 birds a year. But if you're looking at the larger scale of the amount of birds that die every year, bird deaths per gigawatt hour, which is the amount of deaths based on the amount of power that's being produced. So it's kind of the trade-off of the energy system. Wind turbines kill 0.27 birds per gigawatt hour, while fossil fuels actually kill 9.7 birds per gigawatt hour. So obviously there's a massive disparity between those two numbers. Moreover, I would say that pointing towards birds and windmills as being a large problem for bird populations and their ability to survive is kind of off base, because cats kill between 1.3 and 4 billion birds per year, compared to, if you're looking at windmills, the maximum is 500,000 birds per year. So yes, more birds might be dying from windmills, but I would say that there are larger issues that are affecting them more. And in addition, this is a new energy system. So there are going to be things that we run into that we're learning from. So when we're placing windmills, we should be using science and looking at migratory patterns of birds so that those windmills are not put in those locations, which is absolutely possible to do.
If I can catch you there, a couple of points, because they're starting to stack up now. So the one on the cats, I would argue, we have a house cat. He doesn't go outside, but we had an old cat that did go outside. What kind of birds are they taking down? Little songbirds, robins, things that reproduce fast and are never really an issue in terms of how many of them there are. Whereas windmills are taking out your endangered condors, eagles, hawks, falcons, slow to reproduce, slow to bounce back from the brink, already endangered birds. And talking about where wind would be most efficient, right? I mean, naturally, you want to use energy sources that are going to be the most efficient. So you're going to put it in a valley that gets a lot of wind. Well, that's exactly where your vultures and your condors want to also be soaring on that wind. So the idea of saying, okay, we're going to remove these things from their migratory patterns, awesome. Love the idea. However, the places that these animals are going to use to migrate for the least amount of their energy to use are going to be where the most wind is that we want to put our wind power as well. So I would say that it's almost impossible to try to separate those two just based off of both of us wanting to use our most or least energy, depending on who you're talking to. One of the things that you also noted is that the energy that we're producing is what's causing climate change. Am I correct? So that the argument behind this is that the renewable energy will be able to be a cure for climate change. Here's why I would argue against that. So electricity is responsible for only 28% of US CO2 emissions. The rest of it is from other sources. And so the emphasis of reducing CO2 focused on the electricity sector is ridiculous, especially because when you come down to the world CO2 emissions, only the US electricity generated section of it is 4%. So by putting all of our effort into this renewable energy by wind and solar is actually going to do very little, if nothing, to curb or reverse climate change.
To that, I would say that yes, transportation as well as agriculture are the largest contributors to climate change, but we need to diversify our energy field. This is also a good investment because we shifted our investments in the past towards fossil fuels. So we have to shift back. In 1900, 1/3 of US vehicles were electric, and only after internal combustion engines saw big improvements did gasoline take over. So we're seeing the same thing right now, is that there's a push for electric vehicles once again. But the problem is that even if you're driving an electric car, when you plug it in, your power is still coming from a fossil fuel plant. So if we're really trying to reduce our emissions on both sides, both with transportation and with renewable energy, then that's what we have to invest in. Additionally, as we put energy and money and subsidies into solar power, it will provide us with the ability to learn how to make better batteries, which is going to be really important both for transportation as well as renewable energy, because one of the struggles that renewable energy is running into is the ability to store energy. But that solution is one that has to be fixed if renewable energy is going to take over. That same technology is going to be able to be used in transportation. So why would we stay back and invest in something that's killing the planet, that is technologically old at this point, and that is shifting us in the wrong direction, rather than investing in a new energy that, yes, even though it's a smaller portion of global emissions, will pay off in the long run because we will learn how to make better energy storage solutions?
I would say yes. Where I feel the flaw can be is that in the last 10 years of us focusing on trying to make them better, the efficiency of wind and solar has only been by 2%. 2% over 10 years of us fully focusing on this. So the idea to say, okay, we're going to make these more efficient in the future, it's this, oh yeah, well, we're going to get there, we're going to get there. And it's always this, we're going to get there, but we never seem to get there.
I would say to that actually it's almost too efficient, because right now, California right now is actually having to decrease the amount of solar plants that they're building because they produce so much energy that they have to offset it. Which is also the problem with energy storage, is that it produces a lot of energy during the day and then energy is used a lot during the night. So if we invest in, which is why we need to invest in batteries, but rather than actually not having enough energy, we have more than we need. And even though it's growing slowly, it's the fastest energy sector growing in the US right now. And as our technology improves, it'll only be able to do more. Given that we're needing to curtail energy right now in order to not overwhelm the energy grid, it's more of a problem with our energy infrastructure rather than the actual photocells and wind turbines that we have right now.
And okay, I will agree with you that it is based off of what is already in place, is making it insufficient. So it would have to be completely rehauled. But because of the fact that, like you had said, wind or in your case, you were talking about solar is an inconsistent thing, right? I mean, it's during the day, naturally, but it's also in different areas. So California is a great example where it can work because you get a lot of sun a lot of the time. Say up here in Washington, it's not something that's going to be able to work as efficiently as California. On top of the system that it has flaws in it, one of the other things about it is basically coming down to renewable energy credits. So if you're not familiar with what renewable energy credits are, basically right now there's a push in local legislation to say you need to have X amount of renewable energy versus X amount of non-renewable energy. And those renewable energy portions are considered renewable energy credits. And those renewable energy credits are actually not maintained they're not monitored very closely when it comes to a voluntary renewable energy credit. So if I was to say, I want to have my house to be powered by more green energy, that company can say, oh yeah, sure, we'll power you guys some more. But that could be coming from anything from methane from landfills to even poultry litter in some places of Texas. So these are areas that are shortcutting, if you can say that, the renewable energy credit system. So in your system, what you were saying of like there was too much, there's a little bit of a misconception on what is actually happening there. And so they may be touting, oh, we're producing all this stuff, but are they able to not only store it, but use it? Because they may be able to overload their systems and say, oh, we got so much sun, but it's at like between 12 and 3 o'clock. And then after that, they go, yeah, we were not able to store enough for the entire area to use it throughout the night. And then they revert back to this other system or whatever. How the energy already runs through the energy grid is inefficient because, like you had said, it's only valuable during the day, and then it has to be stored and then repumped out. Well, when everything's switching, you can lose some of that energy. And like I said, this renewable energy credit changes the whole game, because even in places of California and Texas, where a lot of this is, I mean, naturally, Texas and California, they got a lot of sun, where a lot of this is being the forefront of changing stuff, they are not only using wrong renewable energy credits to their advantage, they are making you pay up to 20 times more than what it is for them to make.
Yes, so you're right in that our energy grid is currently set up for fossil fuels. That is what we've been putting energy into for the last 100 years. So our system is not set up perfectly for renewable energy.
Mhm.
However, we have the technology to connect these grids. It won't become more expensive for the consumer. Example outside of the US, but applicable to this, is that Ireland is a good example of a country that's highly dependent on imported fossil fuels for 89% of its energy. So they're really, really dependent on being able to burn oil and gas in order to produce energy for its citizens. But in the past 5 years, renewable energy has saved over $1 billion in fossil fuel imports. It's reduced CO2 emissions by 12 million tons, and it hasn't added to the consumer's bills at all. So as we transition, we're going to need to have a dispersed portfolio of generation connected by a wide grid, connecting our energy grids together. And until that's completely streamlined, we can have clean gas on standby. Another technology that's coming out right now is the ability to create ethanol from corn, which is a clean, renewable source of gas that can actually replace fossil fuels. So we no longer need to dig deep into the ground, destroy aquifers, have horrible environmental impacts, when instead we can take some of the corn that we already have subsidied really heavily in the US and convert some of it to natural clean gas.
I'm so glad you brought that up. But before I get there, I got a couple questions. So one, clarifying, what do you mean by connecting the grids? Are you talking about through systems that are already in place, or do we have to build a new, I don't want to say tunnels, but like new wiring throughout the country?
So yeah, our systems are currently set up for siloed grids, and we would need to build the infrastructure to connect them.
So we're rehauling the entire energy system in the US.
We are.
So I would argue, without going too much into it, that will also disrupt millions of acres of wildlife that are in different areas. But we're not even going to get into that, because the other point that you had made, which was how Ireland, was it? That is doing it so efficiently. Why it doesn't work in the US is because you had first talked about how it is cheap, and like in California, they were actually not having to spend that much more. This is because the US government has subsidies on our renewable energy. So they pay a percentage so that company continue to grow. However, these subsidies are only in place for 10 to 25 years, depending on which state and which resource. So as soon as that runs out, what's going to happen is you're going to spike up to 2 to 3 times what you would be paying now. So even if it's not that much, it will end up being more. And just for the sidestep that you had made on the corn, because it was a note that I had made in terms of this other quote unquote renewable option that you have of reducing carbon dioxide emissions. The problem about this is that you are actually producing more in its life cycle the equivalent amount of gasoline, because of how much it takes in terms of water, in terms of maintenance of the corn, so on and so forth. And on top of it, unconsciously, you are consuming up to 40% of the US corn production. And by far, we are the world's largest producer of this basic food. So as soon as we're talking about, oh yeah, we're going to be solving the US maybe renewable energy source, you may also be bringing a lot of devastation in terms of our exports for one, money, two, corn, like I said, which is a basic food source for so many countries.
In terms of subsidies, I would say that every single large-scale governmental program needs subsidies. And fossil fuel companies benefit from global subsidies of 5.3 trillion US dollars a year, which is equivalent to $10 million a minute every day, which is estimated for 2015 to be greater than the total health spending of the world's governments and 6.5% of global gross domestic product. Moreover, as a whole, they're cheaper because if you're thinking of the larger environmental cost of fossil fuels versus nuclear energy, even if you're subsidizing them the same amount, if you're truly looking at the cost of fossil fuels, you have to incorporate all of the children who end up having asthma problems because they live close to a coal plant, all of the people that end up growing up in life and developing a sickness, cancer, because of the particulate matter in our air. And additionally, outside of just human life, fossil fuels contribute to the erosion of topsoil, depletes minerals, and adds salt, which makes land unable to be grown on. It depletes our aquifers as we frack and contaminate water that takes over thousands of years to replenish. It contributes to deforestation that cuts down trees way faster than they can regrow. It depletes our ore quality, leaving us with only low quality ores and making it more difficult to make metallic products. It also contributes to the extinction of other species. And really the big kicker is whether or not fossil fuels are more expensive or less expensive than renewable energy, we're at the point where, again, to deliver a 50% probability, which is not exactly reassuring, of no more than 2 degrees Celsius of warming this century, the world would have to leave 2/3 of its fossil fuel reserves unexploited. 1/3 of the world's oil reserves, half of its gas reserves, and 80% of its coal reserves have to be left untouched, not even taken out of the ground, to avert extremely dangerous levels of global warming. 2 degrees Celsius is dangerous, and 2 degrees Celsius is dangerous enough, but at present we're on a course for around 5 degrees Celsius by the time the century ends. We're getting to the point where outside of subsidies, the overall impact of fossil fuels the overall cost of fossil fuels is magnitudes larger than renewable energy.
So in a simple question, is wind and solar then supposed to be the savior of all this? And if it is, then why is it still... No, you answer it.
I would say that it's needs to be part of the whole because we're diversifying our energy system. And while in this conversation we're focusing on wind and solar, renewable energy is going to come from harnessing tidal energy along with geothermal energy, and so it's hard to say that wind and solar are going to be the saviors of it because they're going to be a large part of the whole, but are not the only solution in themselves.
And if that's the case, and this is where my main argument comes down to, is if this is supposed to be the main way to curb our CO2 emissions, curb climate change, why is it that we're pumping up wind and solar, which out of renewable energies is the 2 largest contributors to CO2? And ultimately, by making it the largest piece of the pie, all you're doing is trading one big company, coal and gas, for another company, which is wind and solar, which is still producing CO2. Now, it may not be as much, but you're still not going to be able to stop that 2%. And now, because these companies, wind and solar, are starting to create quotas with states, bringing it back here to the US, they're creating quotas in the states that require them to use a certain amount of renewable energy credits in the state involuntarily. So this is different than the voluntary one, which is monitored, but still they're going to continue to increase that with the subsidies. All it's going to do is create companies that are now large issues that are the same issues we're having right now with coal and gas. And so if we're going to diversify, why are we diversifying with the worst of them? So by doing this, what we're saying is that the main goal of renewable energy is to offset climate change. So an illogical way is to favor solar and wind, which is what our debate, argument, controversial conversation is today, is that wind and solar in the US is a positive thing.
So given that our debate is whether or not renewable energy is a scam or not, here's what I give you, is that the reason that we're putting so much investment into this is because it's the most cost competitive form of energy today. It's the most cost competitive form of renewable energy. And while it may produce CO2, it produces less than fossil fuels. So not only is it economically cheaper and the fastest growing energy sector in the United States, but it's better for human health and the environment.
Well, and if that's the case, that this is supposedly the best piece for the environment. Again, I've now talked about how it kills wildlife in areas. We have to reinvent the entire grid. You're going to be potentially offsetting a bunch of stuff there as well. You've talked about how it's better for our economy, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's best for the environment, because we're still emitting CO2 emissions. We're still focusing on the wrong issue, which is renewable energy is supposedly supposed to help us curb or slow down at least climate change. And although you said it does reduce it, and that is a fact, that it is less than coal and gas, that does not mean that it's doing it enough. And at that point, what's the reasoning? Because now you're living that environmentally renewable energy is the best scam.
Yep.
Because it's not the savior. And you have people like Elon Musk and Bill Gates that pump up. Even Al Gore has pumped up the fact that this stuff is going to be the savior by burning wood chips and creating solar panels and all these things that are harder to dispose. And now we're putting toxic stuff in the ground. We're taking away land, so on and so forth.
Yes, you're right that wind and solar produce CO2. However, photovoltaic solar panels take 1.6 years to pay off their carbon debt. Whereas
what type?
Like solar panels.
Oh, just so I had some fancy name in there.
Sorry, I said it wrong too, so I'll just redo it.
Okay.
Photovoltaic solar panels take 1.6 years to pay off their carbon debt. So while they're producing CO2, they're taking more out than they would be putting in, whereas fossil fuels only put out. And this technology is comparably young, so it's only going to improve. It's only going to become more efficient.
And again, that goes back to what we were saying, is so far the efficiency has not been increasing. It's been 10 years and we've gone up 2%.
But why give it only 10 years when we've had 100 years of fossil fuels?
And I will give you that.
It's finally reaching the point where it is actually becoming feasible. Actually, if we were to cover the Sahara Desert in solar panels, just say we did that, it would produce enough energy for the globe forever.
And I'm glad you've brought this up, because this brings in another big point that I had, and it is space.
Okay.
How much space in the US, before I get into it, how much space do you say that we need to power the entire US? Any ideas?
None.
None? No space? Or you have no ideas?
I have
no ideas. Okay, so there was this...
I feel like I should put a number in there, though. I don't know.
Well, no, that's fine. You're
okay,
just like,
cool,
I don't know.
Keep going.
Okay, there was this picture, and it was kind of a meme of sorts, a little quote from Elon Musk that was going around on Facebook the last couple of weeks, of when he had said that it would only take 100 square miles, 100 square miles to produce enough energy from solar for the entire country. Now, first, to totally debunk it from the beginning, he also went back and recorrected himself and said 10,000 square miles, which, big difference. But 10,000 square miles is still not that much. In comparison, the US is 3.8 million square miles. However, here's where the fault lies. That's just the solar panels. and solar panels are not the main part of the solar plant. So when you think about it, if you've ever been able to look at a solar plant, or even the ones that people put on their roofs, right? You have the actual panel that goes on the roof, but then somewhere in their garage or next to the house is the huge battery that stores it all. And we've talked about the storage. And on top of this, if you have hundreds of thousands of these, you have to be able to get water trucks through to be able to wash the glasses clean, which, by the way, is also a huge waste of water in places that already don't get a lot of water, deserts, which is taking it away from wildlife. Two, you have to be able to get maintenance vehicles in there. You have to be able to have space between power, the energy itself and the panel so that they don't overheat, like I said, the 900 degrees. So when you actually break it down, it would take 160,000 square miles to power the United States. And an example, which is only 4.2% of the US. However, that would take almost the entire Great Basin Desert, which is 190,000. And so if you think about just that, think about how many species you have to almost entirely wipe off of the US to be able to power 160,000 square miles of just solar if you were to go 100%.
To that, I would argue that if we converted the land that we already use for oil extraction, it would likely add up to 4%. And so if we're just taking land that's been ruined by fracking and extracting oil, putting solar panels over that land that is no longer able to grow anything, then we're really not wiping out any species. We're just converting land that we've already put energy into. I also want to go back to the energy grid really quick. Yeah. Is a possible solution for that is using gravity storage, which with water, which is a technology that we actually already have. We wouldn't necessarily need, in addition to converting and connecting the energy grid. Let me explain this gravity storage. So you have two reservoirs, and when there's too much energy, you use that energy to pump water from one reservoir to the next.
Okay.
And then at night, when you need more energy, it's already stored in that upper reservoir in the form of water, and you let it flow back down, and you reap that energy all over again. So it's not lost. And not only that, but it's a natural source. You no longer have to build cables under the land to do this. You do need mountainous terrain and a large amount of water. However, there are a large amount of lakes around the US as well as reservoirs. And so if we were able to convert some of these reservoirs to these gravity storage facilities, then we would be able to solve the issue of having too much energy for solar. Going back to the land and also bringing in economics once again, because they're the driving force behind both sides of this equation. Building new renewable energy is now cheaper than running existing coal plants, and prices get cheaper every day. By 2025, almost every existing coal plant in the United States will cost more to operate than to build a replacement wind and solar facility within 35 miles of each plant. Which also means that as we're transitioning out of the coal age, all of these workers that are working in the coal plants will easily be able to convert that job into renewable energy working for a wind and solar farm.
Okay, great point. Two things on that. One, in terms of you're talking about the land, I would then argue, I don't know how much studies have been done on this in terms of where coal plants are put versus how efficient would that actually be for the wind and the solar. Because in terms of what I can kind of remember, my family my dad's side lives in Ohio, and I know there's a lot of fracking and stuff that goes on up there. But also through a lot of the year, there's not that much sun and there's not too much wind throughout the year as well. So you're talking about places that may not be that efficient. And so when you break that down, you're still talking about the renewable energy, so wind and solar, that is a very energy dilute item that has to be spread across a huge amount to replicate how much those things are doing in a small amount. So it may be cheaper to do it, but you're going to still use more space. again, back to how much, in the US it's 4%, but then if you spread that out, it's a little bit differently. And then you have to redo the whole energy grid and say, if you're then doing this reservoir thing that you have, which is that's a great idea. I've never thought of that before. That's pretty
Beautiful
cool.
technology.
Beautiful technology. But the idea behind that is still, you have to build all of these new things. And I mean, just think about the Keystone pipeline that was, argued so much a couple of years ago and is back in the news in the last little bit, which we're not going to go down that tangent. But the idea is that any type of movement underground or through an area is going to disturb tons of wildlife and tons of natural habitats. Then you got to talk about how much maintenance has to go into them. People have to go through that area again. You're no longer talking about preserves and areas that are untouched, so on and so forth. But with the jobs, right now, 5.6% of the US population, roughly, or around 10 million people, are employed by coal and gas. And then there's roughly about 300,000 in solar and 120,000 people employed by wind. Now, as it's already been done, 10% of our energy, roughly, comes from wind and solar at the current moment. So if you extrapolate the solar and wind employment by 10, which is still false because you'd have to, change some numbers around. But basically what's going to happen is you're still looking at about 3 million jobs lost right off the top. And on top of that, you have 7 million people that you're going to try to convert from one industry to another. And you've got a lot. The rough median age is about 40 to 45 years old in the coal industry. And these are people that don't necessarily want to retrain themselves from 20 years of experience. And a lot of them are close to retirement. So you're talking about people that aren't going to want to retrain at all. I would say, what are you going to do with that? When we've talked about economics and how it's great for the country, I would say the people that are working here are also a very big benefit.
E2, which is Environmental Entrepreneurs, is a national nonpartisan group of business leaders that advocate for the good of the economy and the environment, recently released the Clean Jobs America report, and it found that nearly 3.3 million Americans are working in clean energy, outnumbering fossil fuel workers by 3 to 1. Secondly, you're correct in saying that there's going to be a population that doesn't want to be retrained. However, as we're shifting and an industry is dying out, which coal consumption fell 4% in 2017 to its lowest point in 39 years due to accelerating coal plant closures and reduced coal plant utilization, shows how much this industry is dying. But the clean energy sector is growing, and it actually offers higher wages than the national average and are widely available to workers with college degrees. Actually, landing a clean energy job can equal 8 to 19% increase in income, and 45% of all workers in clean energy production have only a high school diploma, while still receiving higher wages than similarly educated peers in their industries. So, you're right, people are going to have to convert, but in doing so, they'll likely increase their income, and the job is such that even if you went into the coal industry with only a high school diploma, it's an easy switch. And there are going to be training programs that make it possible to do so.
And that's off of my rough statistics, let's be honest here, that you're also still going to lose 3 million people. You'd have to be 100% wind and solar to get to only 3 million people lost. And so your economics of people are going to make more money. Yeah, naturally, because there's less people that are actually going to be fighting for that money. So I would say that your trade-off is more people with money or less people with more money. And that's kind of a whole different debate in itself. But I think one of the biggest points in this all that I've been saying is that right now, 0.5% of the land is being used for energy production. And when you go to 100% renewable, if that was the case, in just wind and solar, the amount of land that most nations, so now I'm talking more than just the US, most nations would actually get closer to 50% of the earth would have to get to, close to 50% of the land of the earth would have to be wind and solar to power a lot of the countries, because not everybody is blessed with what we have in the US, which is great sun, great wind, kind of throughout the US in many ways. You've got places that have no wind, and you got places that have no sun for many parts of the years. So to be able to store or power it or move it up there, you're talking about a system that ultimately worldwide can never work. But here in the US, like you had said, yes, we've peaked about a decade ago in terms of our CO2 emissions. But right now, this is not just a conspiracy anymore. This is no longer something that we can call climate deniers or right-wing people. This is a argument that is being brought upon by everybody and saying that wind and solar is an unsustainable option for the US to go in the direction of.
So I would say that if it's true that we have to convert 50% of our land to wind and solar, approximately 50% of the world right now, approximately 50% of the world use of land right now is towards agriculture. And given that we can easily put solar panels and wind turbines on agricultural land, you're not actually having to completely construct new land and cut down more trees and destroy the environment more.
Potentially.
Again,
it could go back to my original point of how that would work coexistingly, and especially with other countries with, say, more precious or more elaborately, they go out in different areas, types animals.
To that, I would also say that developed countries right now with wind and solar are actually at a disadvantage in comparison to developing countries that don't already have an energy grid. Our main problem that we talked about is the fact that we have to convert our energy grid and find a new way to hold energy in a place in a battery so that it can then be moved elsewhere. But developing countries, solar provides the individual the opportunity to have all of the power that they would need for their day, and their energy grids are not built yet. So they would have the technology to be able to build energy grids that share energy between them and use solar and wind energy effectively. In order to be on a path where we increase no more than 2 degrees Celsius of warming this century, the world has to leave 2/3 of its fossil fuel reserves unexploited. So we have to find a new way to get energy if we want to continue to live on this earth in a way that is healthy for everybody and continual for the human species. And that solution is renewable energy.
Yeah, and I think that's a good place for us to stop. Mostly because I think time-wise we're running pretty tight here, but also just the idea that I think there's enough said by both of us here to allow you guys to think a little bit more about maybe what you've come into this conversation already pondering, be able to now step away and hopefully throughout the next week, 2 weeks until our next episode, to kind of talk about it amongst yourself and
in our Facebook group.
In our Facebook group. So make sure to come check us out on Facebook and go to our Facebook group. It's called Podcast Discussions. And we can talk about this further as well, because I think this is a great conversation. There is a lot of in between. So I think this is a great maybe spot for us to talk about our own personal opinions. For me, I think that large scale changes is not impossible, but it's not the right way to go. I think if there was more of a investment from households to say convert to personal solar panels or personal, I'm not going to say windmills because that's like ridiculous, but if you could do water well, something that is on your own land, it's just for you type stuff, it would actually be a lot more sustainable. And then you're talking about big cities and stuff, they would have the grids. So I think that's kind of where I'm at, is that it has to be more of a personal battle than it is a trying to fuel the entire country from one plant or multi plants. Further, I think the other piece of it is we need to come at renewable energy with a mindset of using it when it's at its peak. So kind of the same way that you would say, hey, I got to go to the gym today. You look at your day and you'd say, okay, here's where I'm going to do it. Or I want to go on a hike. So you go and look at what the weather's going to be. We have to do the same thing with our energy. If we want to run the dishwasher or the washing machine or whatever it is, it's going to take a lot of power. We have to say, okay, it's going to be really hot at 2:00. It's when I'm going to run it. I'm not going to try to run it when it's 8:00 at night. And I think if we became more efficient in that, these numbers would be very drastically different because it's based off of where we normally run a lot of it, which is kind of the evening time. People are coming back from work. And I know it's kind of impossible for some households to do that. But if you can power a lot of your stuff during the peak, I know there's a friend of mine who has his own personal systems. That's how he runs it. He charges his car. He has a Tesla. He charges his car during the day when he's at his peak. He runs his dishwasher, washing machine, anything that needs to be done like that. He does filming as well. So if he ever needs to power batteries or anything, that's all during the day. And then during the night, the only time he ever plugs in is if he needs light, naturally, or if he wants to, say run his computer or whatever. That's it. He tries to plan everything else around the middle of the day. And that, I think, is what a lot of the country would have to switch to on top of having your own personal.
Yeah, systems. I think that's a really good point. I think that the way we live is a large part of the problem. The way that we use energy without bounds, because
that's never been a problem.
It's never been a problem. Yeah. We've been conditioned to think like, okay, yeah, we have all of these resources. Whenever I turn the light on, it turns on. That's also specific to the US.
Yes. Well, and like when the power goes out and we all just go,
what do I do?
What now?
Yeah.
I don't even know what to do with my hands. I can't use my phone because then I'm gonna have to charge it. Where do I go? And power outages for a couple of days, and you're like, okay, I'm done.
Yeah. So I think we need to change our way of living. I think just overall, both the way that we use technology, electricity, also just as consumers. But I also do believe that renewable energy does need help from the government. It's something that we have to push for.
It's a hard one because I don't to get into the economics of stuff. I don't really want to.
No.
But there is a lot of elements that, we're like, oh, the U.S. is already so far in debt, and the U.S. is now like struggling to even support during, say, COVID. There's so many issues, and say current administration, that there is, an arm's length put between renewable energy in the U.S. And I don't think it's going to get much better in some degrees. And that's what's hard about this and this is why large scale is probably near impossible.
Yeah. I would say, so in terms of when I say governmental programs, or when I say that renewable energy needs governmental help, I'm thinking of like the new 100% Clean Economy Act, which puts a lot of energy in the US, which puts a lot of subsidies and economic work into building the renewable energy sector. But it also acknowledges that it's going to take time to phase out fossil fuels and that we're going to need to use both. Personally, I think that we just need a much more diverse system of energy. I'm not sure that it's necessarily we have to convert completely to wind and solar, but again, we should be incorporating hydropower, even though at this point most of the world's most of the world's rivers have dams, and so that sector can't really grow that much. We're figuring out how to harness tidal power, but right now it's expensive because putting things in the sea, you have to do a lot of management. But we're figuring out these new technologies.
Yeah, even your reservoir thing.
Even the reservoir thing.
Gosh, I'm
is huge. Yeah, same. In the reservoir thing is huge. But we just need to move to a point where we're not completely reliant on one energy source that's also finite. It's going to run out.
Yeah.
And so we have to have plans for the future.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think we need to diversify. And I think every state's different, right? Washington is great with water. I mean, we have water all over the place, right? You got the rivers and all that stuff. Now, granted, we also have tons of salmon, which changes a whole lot of stuff. And so that's a whole other debate. That's why we didn't even bring in those into this conversation. Maybe it'll be another one. But ultimately, I think every state can be handled differently. Obviously, Texas is a great place for solar. I don't think anyone's going to argue that it shouldn't be used there.
Yeah.
California has been doing decent with some of it. There is some issues with it, but that's California. So there's a lot of things. Ultimately, I think that's a great way to kind of sum up our day here of being able to talk this through, sum up the podcast. And I hope this will allow us to start a conversation on our Facebook group. with your family and friends. Maybe share this with somebody. And ultimately, like we said in our first episode, the goal of this series is to allow the bridge between opposite views to be able to start a healthy conversation, trying to drop some of the biases, and ultimately understand that we're in this all together for the environment, not all against the environment. We may have different tactics, but we have to come back at it. So any other last thoughts?
I would just say that, yeah, the other point of this was to encourage discussion. So maybe take some of what you've learned today, go do more research if you want, find your own kind of personal stance on it, and go talk to somebody about it. Maybe somebody that agrees with you, maybe somebody that doesn't. But I think this is something that we should be talking about, controversial topics, renewable energy moving forward into the future. So go talk to your mom, your dad, your friend, boyfriend, girlfriend, anybody about this.
Yeah.
And we'll see you in 2 weeks for the other one.
Yeah. If you've got more topics that you would like us to go through, let us know. Put them in the comments if you're watching on not Facebook. Well, I guess you could listen to it on Facebook because it's got a link. But if you're watching us on YouTube, put it down in the comment section. If you're on Anchor or any of our platforms that we're producing through that, then feel free to email us and contact us any way, and we'll add your topics onto our list as well. So
see you on the next Controversial Conservation.
Way to end it. However the song goes.
Seagulls.
Yes.
This is why we have these tiny cuts.
Yeah, this is what YouTube's for. Thanks for watching it on YouTube, guys.